Thank you, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be able to be here. And I also say that I'm not sure if this is the case for some of you, but for me, that when you have a goal or when you have a task that you have to get ready for, that it helps you do things that you want to do, but you don't always feel like you have time to do. So I really appreciate the opportunity to get back into the text of Talmud because it has been a little while as a rabbi for over 11 years, and interestingly enough, I think some of you may know this, but that the job of a rabbi is often not to study Talmud. It's to bang your head against a computer screen, figuring out, oi, why is Outlook not working? So that is, I really enjoy the opportunity to be able to come and learn, and hopefully, please give feedback to see if the way that I'm approaching it is something that you want to continue. One other just quick follow up from Rachel about what else I'm offering. The podcast, which is out now, it is called Interfaithing: Why Families Can Embrace Two Faiths Under One Roof. It is do it together with a Christian colleague. It's a really fascinating conversation about interfaith families. You can find it on any podcast platform. Would love to get your feedback on it if you're able to listen. And the course that I'm teaching through Gratz on Israel, that is going to be starting in the end of February. It's going to be an 8-session course. You can go to Gratz College and you can see all the offerings for the next spring semester. And it's, again, all over Zoom. So hopefully be able to attend that. So, but now we're going to get back to the topic at hand, which is Talmud Torah. So before I begin, I think that in any moment in which we're able to come and learn together, it's important to offer a blessing for this moment. And so I'd like to begin with a bracha. Please feel free to join in if you know it. It's a blessing for studying Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So there are many different ways to approach Talmud. And I know that in the past, you've had teachers who focus on a small part of the text as well as on the entire range of the weekly dapim that we're learning. I'm going to try to kind of mix the two together. So the first part is going to be just a very quick run through of all the Mishnayot that are kind of covered over the past week in terms of the dapim in the Talmud, but we're going to look at it in the Mishnah because it's just a little smaller chunk to be able to get through. And the idea is just really to kind of run through. In good Talmud language, it's called bikiyut, that you're just doing it in order to be able to kind of get through all of the text to be able to accomplish that. And so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time trying to unpack each of the different Mishnayot as we're going through. But if there are any questions, please feel free to ask them. And then at the end of the run through, if you have any questions, we'll be able to go through them. And then afterwards, I'm going to pick out a couple of different texts different sugyot to learn, to focus on. In case you don't know, sugyot or sugya is the specific section of text that is kind of like its own idea or its own focus that we want to be able to learn. And so it's a good way to kind of divide all of like these amazing large dapim, these pages of text, into kind of smaller chunks. So I'm going to focus on a couple of sugyot. Now, the way I'm going to focus on them is also maybe a little bit different. I'm not sure if you've talked about this with other teachers. But I've been learning with a chavruta, a rabbi by the name of Rab Hutner, who was a modern Orthodox rabbi who is from the first half of the 20th century. If you think about Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik, he's kind of like in that realm of who he was and his learning and his teaching. And I'm learning with my chavruta. Essentially, we were talking about Hanukkah, but he doesn't talk about Hanukkah. He uses Hanukkah as a launch pad to actually talk about the nature of the covenant between the Jewish people and God. And what he says is fascinating. He says that the nature of the brit, the nature of the covenant between God and the Jewish people, is that the brit, the covenant, is an oral covenant. It is an oral tradition, meaning that we cannot write down the covenant into discrete words and letters to be able to be passed on to the next generation. Anytime we write down a text, it's because we're worried about forgetting it. But that the very nature of the covenant is that it is passed down orally from one teacher to the other, from a teacher to students, a teacher that they get it from their teachers. And there's always this line of tradition of passing it down. Now, what he really means by that is that embedded within the covenant is this unique feature that allows the covenant to only exist between God and the Jewish people. Because if you write down what the covenant says, then anyone, any group could take those words and say, now it's our covenant. So there's a certain kind of polemic here between the relationship of other faith traditions and God. But what Rav Hutner is really saying is that if we want to take seriously what it means to be a chosen people, that God has elected us to be able to be in a special relationship, well, that's a relationship that's more like a family. And if you think about a family dynamic, the text of the family isn't written down. You don't really sit down and study together as a family. You live life as a family. You talk as a family. You have conversations as a family. You have that oral tradition that's passed down with parents teaching how to cook, how to be able to ride a bike, how to do all the different things that family does. And what's so interesting about Talmud especially, and this is part of the point of the study of Talmud, is that even though the Talmud is written down, it is designed, and this is the fascinating thing that Rav Hutner says, it was designed from the outset to retain that orality of the tradition. Meaning, all of the quote unquote mistakes or the tangents or the ridiculous kind of debates back and forth and like, where does this come from? How do they bring it out? All of those are actually to indicate that it's like any conversation. I don't know about you, but most conversations I have start in one place and end in a completely different other one, where you have a tangent. It's like, oh, that reminds me of this. Oh, this reminds me of that. And that when you're passing along tradition as well, or let's say if you're telling a story, that the story that you pass on, you may bring in details that aren't actually relevant to what you're talking about at first, but rather you're just sharing all the details because that's how you remember the story. And those pieces of how oral traditions are offered in actually like talking to each other are actually found within the written text itself, as if to say that we are engaging in an oral conversation with our sages in the Talmud. So I'm going to highlight a number of those passages that demonstrate the orality of the text, because I think it's a really interesting way to look at Talmud, that so we don't get lost in all of like the ridiculous number of half ransom, quarter ransom turns into a quarter ransom and an eighth ransom, if you remember that part from the Dapim here. So I hope that you'll find this interesting, but we only have a short amount of time. So I'm going to get going right now. I'm going to open the, I'm going to share my screen, and on my screen, just going to move this down so I can see it better. Oh, whoops. Okay. So we're going to start actually with Mishnah Bava Kama, chapter 4, Mishnah 4. This is from the very beginning of our learning. This is from Sefaria.org, which if you've not learned with Sefaria or use Sefaria, it's incredible. And I'll talk a little bit more about why it's so incredible, because it relates to how I want to teach today. So if an ox of a halakhically competent person gored an ox of a deaf mute, an imbecile, or a minor, all of whom are not considered halakhically competent, the owner, who is halakhically competent, is liable for damages. But if an ox of a deaf mute, an imbecile, or a minor gored an ox of a halakhically competent person, the owner of the ox is exempt from liability because they're not halakhically liable. If an ox belonging to a deaf mute, an imbecile, or a minor gored another ox and caused damage, the court appoints a steward for them and warns them with regard to the ox that gored in the presence of the steward. The ox is thereby rendered a forewarned ox, which I know last week with Rabbi Goldberg, you kind of talked about this idea of what it means to be forewarned, that you have like three different examples of goring, and then that ox is forewarned. And if they do it again, then not only the ox is liable for death, but so is the owner, in which case the owner can actually ransom his life with a payment. And that's when we're going to get to the word ransom. So it's a very steep tax for letting your ox gore someone. And then we have a steward, since the steward is considered its owner with regard to the requirement of the verse, and warning has been given to its owner. If, after the ox was rendered forewarned in this manner, the deaf mute regained his hearing, the imbecile became halachically competent, or the minor reached the age of majority, the ox is thereby reverted to its status of innocuousness. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir, who maintains that the ox had the status of a forewarned ox only while it was under the custody of the steward. Now, by the way, just in terms of thinking about Safari for a second, all the bold statements are what's written in the text. All of the non-bolded statements is commentary crafted by Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, Zichrono Livracha, who actually helps us understand what the text is saying. Rabbi Yossi says it retains its previous status of being forewarned. If a stadium ox, i.e. one that is trained to fight in a stadium, gores and kills a person, it is not liable to be put to death, as it is stated. And if an ox gores a man or a woman, this is referring only to an ox that gores on its own initiative, but not to the case of an ox where others induced it to gore. Therefore, the owner of a stadium ox, which is trained to gore, is exempt from liability if it does. Okay? Next Mishnah. With regard to an ox that gored a person and the person died, if the ox was forewarned, its owner pays ransom, meaning for his life. But if it was innocuous, he's exempt from paying the ransom. And both this forewarned ox and that innocuous ox are liable to be put to death for killing a person. And the same halakha applies in a case where the animal killed a boy, and the same applies in a case where it killed a girl. So we also have those bringing in children, minors, and the Talmud actually talks a lot about that, about why they bring them in. If the ox gored and killed a Canaanite slave or a Canaanite maidservant, its owner gives the victim's master 30 sela, whether he was a slave worth 100 maneh, i.e. 100 silver dinars, or worth only 1 dinar. So what's interesting about that, and the Talmud talks about it, we're not going to get into it, is that at times, because there's a set amount for a slave, that you could actually pay more for a slave than if you killed a free man. And so there becomes an issue that the Talmud deals with. Next Mishnah, Mishnah 6. If an ox was rubbing against a wall and as a result the wall fell on a person and killed him, or if the ox intended to kill another animal but killed a person, or if it intended to kill a Gentile but killed a Jew, or intended to kill a non-viable baby but killed a viable person, in all these cases, the ox is exempt from being killed. By the way, the idea of ox rubbing against a wall is like when you have that itch on the back that you can't really get to, and I can't see everyone's faces, but if like you kind of move onto like a kind of like a not straight, but like a corner surface, you just try to get that little itch. It's like, oh, that feels good. That's actually what they're talking about in terms of that he's doing it for pleasure and not necessarily doing it because he's trying to harm someone or trying to push things over. Mishnah 7, with regard to an ox belonging to a woman, and similarly an ox belonging to orphans, and an ox belonging to orphans that is in the custody of their steward, and a desert ox, which is ownerless, like a deserted ox, and an ox that was consecrated to the temple treasury, and an ox belonging to a convert who died and has no heirs, rendering the ox ownerless. All of these oxen are liable to be put to death for killing a person. Rabbi Yehuda says a desert ox, a consecrated ox, and an ox belonging to a convert who died are exempt from being put to death since they have no owners. So interesting that there's a difference of opinion that the Talmud very much goes into why, and Rabbi Yehuda says that they do not have to be put to death when the rabbis say they do. Mishnah 8, with regard to an ox that is leaving court to be stoned for killing a person and its owner then consecrated it, it is not considered consecrated, i.e. the consecration does not take effect since deriving benefit from the ox is prohibited and the ox is therefore worthless. This is talking about a situation where if you consecrate the ox after it's been designed, if it's been deemed to be killed, then it's worthless because the ox is not allowed to be worth anything since it's sentenced to be dead. If one slaughtered it, its flesh is forbidden to be eaten and is prohibited to derive benefit from it. But if its owner consecrated it before its verdict, the ox is considered consecrated, and if he slaughtered it, its flesh is permitted. So as long as you do it before the sentence, you're okay. If the owner of an ox conveyed it to an unpaid bailee or to a borrower, to a paid bailee or to a renter, and it caused damage while under custody, they enter into the responsibilities and liabilities in place of the owner. Therefore, if it was forewarned, the bailee pays the full cost of the damage, and if it's innocuous, he pays half the cost of the damage. Forewarned, full, innocuous, half. That's the general principle. If the ox's owner tied it with reins to a fence or locked the gate before it in an appropriate manner, but nevertheless the ox emerged and caused damage, whether the ox is innocuous or forewarned, the owner is liable, since this is not considered sufficient precaution to prevent damage. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. There's actually a very interesting question about what is sufficient to cause, to stop an animal from causing damage. And Rabbi Eliezer, who I'm not sure if he's brought up right here, actually he does, is saying that the only way to do it is by killing it. Therefore, there's no really way to stop an animal from doing what an animal does. Rabbi Yehuda says that if the ox is innocuous, the owner is liable, even if he safeguarded it appropriately. Since the Torah does not limit the required safeguarding for innocuous ox, but if the ox is forewarned, the owner is exempt from paying compensation for damage, as it is stated in the verse describing damage by a forewarned ox. And the owner has not secured it, and this ox that was tied with reins or behind a locked gate was secured. Rabbi Eliezer says an ox has no sufficient safeguarding at all, other than slaughtering it with a knife, because there is no degree of safeguarding that exempts the owner's ox from liability. And that's the end of chapter 4, but that's not the end of all of our dapim. So chapter 5, in the case of an innocuous ox that gored and killed a cow, and the cow's fetus was found dead at its side, and is not known whether the cow gave birth before the ox gored it, and the fetus's death is unrelated to the goring, or whether it gave birth after the ox gored it, and the fetus died on account of the goring, the owner of the ox pays half the cost of the damage for the cow, and 1/4 of the cost of the damage for the offspring. By the way, if you read through the Talmud on this, they love playing with half and quarter. Maybe it's half of the half, quarter of the quarter. My head was spinning in terms of the number, the way that the math was being done. Since it is uncertain whether the ox was responsible for the death of the fetus, in which case he would pay half the damages, its owner pays only half the amount for the fetus that he would ordinarily be required to pay, i.e. 1/4. And likewise, there's uncertainty in the case of an innocuous ox. An innocuous cow that gored an ox, and the cow's newborn offspring was found at its side dead or alive, because this time it's the cow goring the ox, not the other way around. And it is not known whether the cow gave birth before it gored the ox or whether the cow gave birth after it gored. When damage is caused by an innocuous animal, the liability of the owner is limited to the value of the animal that gored. Therefore, half the cost of the damage is paid from the value of the cow, as in the standard case of an innocuous animal. And if that does not suffice to pay for half the cost of the damage, 1/4 of the cost of the damage is paid from the offspring, since it is uncertain whether the offspring was part of the cow at the time the cow gored, and the owner pays only half of what he would pay if it were certain that it was part of the cow. Notice that offspring or fetus is related to being within the cow, because it's not considered to be its own viable entity until after it's born. And that plays an important deal in terms of how much money is owed to the person who was injured, or to the animals that were injured. In the case of a potter who brought his pots into a homeowner's courtyard without permission, and the homeowner's animal broke the pots, the homeowner is exempt. If the owner's animal was injured by the pots, the owner of the pots is liable. But if the potter brought them inside with permission, the owner of the courtyard is liable if his animal caused damage to the pots. Similarly, if someone brought his produce into the homeowner's courtyard without permission, and the homeowner's animal ate them, because there's good food out there, the homeowner is exempt. If his animal was injured by them, e.g. if it slipped on them, the owner of the produce is liable. But if he brought his produce inside with permission, the owner of the courtyard is liable for the damage caused by his animal to them. Basically, if you don't want to be liable, don't invite someone in with crazy animals or pots or whatever it may be. And now you're going to allow an ox into your courtyard? I'm not so sure that that's a good idea. Similarly, if one brought his ox into the homeowner's courtyard without permission, and the homeowner's ox gored it, or the homeowner's dog bit it, the homeowner is exempt. If it gored the homeowner's ox, the owner of the goring is liable. Furthermore, if the ox he brought to the courtyard without permission fell into the owner's pit and contaminated its water, so i.e. this is like a water, I guess a well where you have a lot of water that they're using for all different purposes, the owner of the ox is liable to pay compensation for despoiling the water, because where you're going to get your shower water from or your cooking water from. If the homeowner's father or son were inside the pit at the time the ox fell and the person died as a result, I'm still trying to figure out how that works. The owner of the ox pays the ransom for the killing of those lives. But if he brought the ox into courtyard with permission, the owner of the courtyard is liable for the damage caused. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says the homeowner is not liable in any of the cases in the Mishnah, even if he gave his permission for the items to be brought into his premises, unless he explicitly accepts responsibility upon himself to safeguard them. I'm going to pause here because even though the next Mishnah Yod actually are mentioned in our section, we're running out of time, and I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of these sugyot. So just want to see if there are any questions, Rachel, are there any questions that people have specifically about anything that they're a little confused on that they want to have answered? And I'll see if I can do that in a minute or so.
Let me see. I think I think go ahead. There was something here, I can't find it now, about whether animals actually have intention, which is an interesting thing to think about. But I think we all kind of know that, animals don't have like maybe our level of intellectual cognition, but they certainly have some level of intention.
What it basically is saying is that it's more about control, right? If you think about a dog and how dogs need to be trained, that it's up to it's the owner's responsibility to try and train the dog. If the owner can't train the dog, then you have to kind of figure out, where can I put this dog? Where can I send this dog? Or what do I have to do about this dog? Because they're uncontrollable. And it's ultimately up to you. To some degree, the question about intent is less about the animal itself and more about the owner and their level of responsibility of caring for their animal.
Okay. Thank you. And we have one question. Why don't we take the one question, the hand raise, and then maybe one sugya is probably what we'll have time for. Okay. So this is Joseph. Good. Joseph, you should have unmuting powers.
Hey, thank you. Just a question on what you said at the very beginning about the Brit being oral tradition.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Is that in reference to the written Torah, that it was originally oral and then transmitted to written?
So it's a fascinating point that you're raising here, because is the written Torah considered to be oral as well? One could argue that the written Torah is also an oral tradition. If you look at some of the different changes within the context of the text itself, for instance, take a look at the different versions of the Ten Commandments. Take a look at the way in which the laws about slaves changes between Exodus and Deuteronomy. It's as if there's midrash, there's commentary on what's said in the Torah itself. So that may also be, in a sense, an oral tradition. However, what we have done with the written Torah is turn it into a specific written text that is no longer the foundation of the covenant, because any tradition could take the written text and use it for their own understanding of their covenant, thinking about the idea of Old Testament and New Testament, meaning that it is now can be used by many other faith traditions. The nature of the Brit being oral is actually transcends the issue of what the text says in and of itself, that even if something is written down, like the written Torah or the oral Torah, meaning the Talmud, that the nature of the Brit being oral is still beyond that. It is more important than the actual words that are on the page. So, and actually, we're going to get into that if we can, with this one little text. And so, the text that I want to share with you is related to how the Gemara itself basically says, wait, where did this idea come from? How do we actually know what is being said here? Because I think if we think about the way in which orality is shared, is taught, or I should say that how we transmit certain information one to the other, that the nature of the conversation teaches us that we don't have all the details, because we're fallible human beings. Can't have total recall. And sometimes the text seems to indicate that these rabbis had incredible recall. They knew everything that they were saying at one point or the other. But in fact, the Talmud actually says, no, they're regular human beings who are trying to remember and sometimes forget. So let's go into one of them. This is from one of the Mishnayot that we read, having to do with an ox belonging to a woman, an ox belonging to orphans, stewards, a desert ox consecrated to the temple, and having to do with them being consecrated or given away prior to the verdict being read, and that's allowed. But if it's given, if the verdict is already given, then the animal has to die and the consecration does not work. So here's the Gemara. The sages taught in the passage discussing an ox that kills a person. The Torah states an ox, repeating this word 7 times. So now we have to understand each of those 7 times it's mentioned. And it's mentioned those times to include an additional 6 cases, in addition to the classic case of an ox goring and killing a person. So 6 more, and here they are. They are an ox belonging to a woman, an ox belonging to orphans, an ox belonging to orphans that is in the custody of a steward, desert ox, a consecrated ox, an ox belonging to a convert who died and has no heirs. Right? Rabbi Yehuda says a desert ox, consecrated ox, an ox belonging to a convert who died and has no heirs are all exempt from being put to death since they have no owners. This we all got from the Mishnah. This is nothing new. But now we have a little bit of the Gemara trying to interpret. Rav Huna says Rabbi Yehuda deemed the ox exempt even if it gored and killed and its owner ultimately consecrated it, or if it gored and he ultimately renounced his ownership over it, since at the time of the trial, in court, the ox does not have an owner. So what he's basically saying is that just as you don't have it, when you don't have an owner, then the ox is fully exempt, having to do again with that notion of that the warning is not given necessarily just to the ox, but rather to the owner that you have to take care of your animal. The Gemara asks, from where did Rav Huna derive this assertion? From the fact that Rabbi Yehuda teaches 2 cases, a desert ox and an ox belonging to a convert who died and has no heirs. Because if you go back up to the Mishnah, you have all these 6 cases, but then Rabbi Yehuda only mentions a desert ox, a consecrated ox, and an ox belonging to a convert who died. He only gives those examples. He doesn't give all 6 of them. So the Gemara is trying to then unpack that and say, what is the legal status of an ox belonging to a convert who died? Since he has no heirs, it is considered to be an ownerless ox. Accordingly, the case of a desert ox is the same as the case of an ox belonging to a convert who died and has no heirs, and it does not seem necessary for the Braita to state both cases. That's why Rabbi Yehuda here does not actually bring in some of the other cases, because he's saying, or I should say that he does not need to say all 3 of these situations of the desert ox, a consecrated ox, and an ox belonging to a convert who died, because all of those are ownerless. Rather, that the reason why he brings all 3 of these in is in order to show that the renouncing of the ownership of making them a desert ox, a consecrated ox, an ox belonging to a convert who died and has no heirs, that all of them are actually, except for the last one, but the desert ox and the consecrated ox, that those are specific cases after the killing happens. Meaning, it's not just a regular deserted ox or a consecrated ox. It is that the owner says, I don't really want to have this ox, and so I'm going to renounce my ownership. And Rabbi Yehuda, if he only said an ox belonging to a convert who died and has no heirs, you would not think that someone could renounce ownership after the killing. So therefore, that's why, according to the Gemara, he brings all 3 of those cases in. And then Gemara conclude from the Braita that this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. So we have it doesn't always happen, but we have, okay, great, we have this answer, and now we can move on. It doesn't always happen in Talmud. But now.
Okay, you got a couple questions here.
Please.
Why, I'm sorry. Why seems like anyone with an ox could declare it ownerless right after it gores in order to avoid liability beyond the value of the ox.
That's correct.
That game the system. Why wouldn't everyone just do
that? They actually could theoretically game the system. Part of this is the question of, does this ever happen? But the problem is that it's all after you can't do it after the verdict. So think about it this way. Let's say you believe that your ox is is innocent, if you decide to give up your ox before the verdict, after the killing, but before the verdict, and the verdict is this ox is exempt, that actually did not happen in the right way, then you would lose your ox. You would lose that money. Of course, if it's guilty, then you're not actually liable at all. So part of it is about the idea of whether you're going to stand behind your ox, especially if you think that it's innocent. Now, if it actually happened for real and you know that it did, then I think there's a good question about how you might game the system. And the Talmud does deal with that a little bit, but we're not going to get into that right now. Because what I wanted to focus on for this last little bit is that even though we seem to have a clear answer, the Gemara seemingly brings in another Breita, another section of text that is similar to this. But it's like, wait, we already have an answer. We had a question about Rabbi Yehuda. That's clear. Why are we bringing in something different? So here's what it says. The Gemara asks, but don't we require, actually, I'm sorry. This assertion is also taught in a Breita. Moreover, Rabbi Yehuda said that even if it gored and he ultimately consecrated it, or if it gored and he ultimately renounced ownership over it, the ox is exempt as it is stated, and warning has been given to its owner, and it is killed, the ox shall be stoned. It is derived from here that the owner of the ox is exempt unless the ox's status as the owner's property at the time of the death of the victim and at the time of the owner's standing trial is the same, i.e. that the ox has an owner. But the Gemara asks, but don't we require that the ox's status be the same at the time of the verdict as well? And isn't the phrase the ox shall be stoned also referring to the verdict? Rather, amend the statement and say that the owner of the ox is exempt unless the ox's status as the owner's property at the time of the death of the victim and at the time of the owner's standing trial and at the time of the verdict are identical as one. Now, the reason why this is so important is because that when it says this language of how this rule should be explained, what it's actually doing is having an issue with the way in which the language is being written in the context of the text. Meaning this, if you take a look at the Hebrew of the Mishnah, it says, up here, sure, Hagar, nope, that's not there. Sorry, let me back up. Let me come back down here. Okay. That it says, this line, that this is kind of how it ends the statement about Rabbi Yehuda. Ad shetehe mita v'ha'amada badin shavin ke'echad. That unless the ox's status as the owner's property at the time of the death of the victim and at the time of the owner's standing trial is the same, i.e. that the ox has an owner. That's the language here. Ad shetehe mita v'ha'amada badin shavin ke'echad. That both death and both the standing at the trial are as one. But the Gemara is saying, wait, that actually is not how it should be read. It should be read as ad shetehe mita v'ha'amada badin ugmar din shavin ke'echad. Ugmar din is new in this statement. Ad shetehe mita v'ha'amada badin, until the point of it, of the killing and also of standing of judgment, and the end of the judgment, meaning that the verdict is given that unless all of those things happen and he is owned for all three of those things, then the ox is, if he's owned, then the ox is liable, and if he's not owned, then the ox is exempt. As if to say, this line of Ugmar Din should be the way that we remember this text, the way that we remember this particular issue. That if we don't have that final statement, then the text does not actually make sense. But another way to view it is that the Talmud is saying, maybe we're misremembering the exact line that Rabbi Yehuda is referring to, or the way in which it's being passed down. Because haven't we used shorthand in describing something, saying it's over there? But what's over there? The remote to the TV is over there. But why do you care that it's over there? The remote to the TV so we can turn off the TV is over there. Like sometimes we use shorthand in how we describe things and how we talk about matters within our own home. And it is almost as if the Talmud at first was saying, we're just going to combine all of these different issues of making sure that he's owned at the time of the killing, at the time of the trial, and at the time of the verdict, all as one. But the Gemara is almost bringing in a whole new section just to tell us that, maybe we're misremembering the exact way that this teaching is being passed down. That is an example of the nature of the orality of the Talmud. And I could go in, have a number of different examples throughout these sugyot. And next time, if I'm so lucky to be invited back, I'll probably spend more time on some of these sugyot to demonstrate that orality of the text. But that it is so amazing to think that when you have an answer, that the Talmud is like raising up a different question because it's got another job to do, which is to remind us that these are people who are passing along traditions, and maybe we're misremembering, maybe we're not understanding, or you know what, they should have brought up this idea that they shared in a different place. Why didn't they not bring it to this place? They're raising questions that aren't necessarily pertinent to the issue that they're trying to resolve, but they want to bring it up anyway in order to demonstrate that this is an oral tradition that can only be passed down when you have teachers and learners and asking questions and having that back and forth. And so with that, I hope that you enjoyed the class, and thank you so much. And I hope that we'll be back at another point in time.
Thank you, Rabbi Sachs. Always interesting, I think, to contemplate the ways in which the oral Torah, right, the Talmud, which is oral Torah, Torah Shebaal Peh, the Torah, right, oral Torah, and yet we have it in the written form. So trying to use the written form to mediate back to the orality of the text and seeing how it works in the written form, it's just one of the other things that I think makes the Talmud really interesting and exciting, and so different from other things that we study. Thank you for coming for the first time here. Thank you, all of you, for a warm welcome, and it's good to see you all. And we will see you next week for the last class of the year. Okay, bye, everyone.